Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jessica. I'm with Literary Arts. Thank you all for being here for an evening with the 2022 finalist for the Sarah Winnemucca Award for Creative Nonfiction. And thanks to all our finalists for joining us tonight. I know it's hard, but thanks for being here. Before we get started, I'm going to open up this space with the land acknowledgement. Literary Arts is based in Portland, Oregon, and we are currently on unceded land. The Monoma, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Wolalabans, the Tualatin Kalpuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River occupied and operated on this land long before Western colonizers arrived, and many continue to do so today. Despite attempts of removal and erasure, these communities remain a strong and vital part of our future. Literary Arts recognizes that this acknowledgement is only a small step in affirming the ongoing contributions of our Native communities, and we commit to engaging these communities more fully as we fulfill our mission. For those of you who are not familiar with Literary Arts, we are a nonprofit community-based arts organization with a 37-year history of serving readers and writers. Our mission is to engage readers, support writers, and to inspire the next generation with great literature. Some of our programs include the Portland Arts and Lectures, programs for youth, the Oregon Book Awards and Fellowships Program, and the Portland Book Festival. We also offer reader seminars, writing classes, and free literary events like this one year-round. And just as a reminder, our Oregon Book Awards ceremony will be held in person this year at the Armory on Monday, April 25th. For tickets and more information, head over to literary-arts.org, and I can put that in the chat. And now we're going to get started. Thank you all for being here. Just a quick little reminder of how tonight will go. I will introduce each reader, and then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A at the end of all our readings. And to answer or to ask questions, you will see a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. But if you put it in the chat, I'll also probably catch it, so no worries. All righty, we're gonna get started. Our first reader tonight is David Biespiel. David is the author of 12 books. He is a recipient of Lana National Endowment for the Arts and Stegner Fellowships and 2 Oregon Book Awards. The founder of the Attic Institute of Arts and Letters. He is poet in residence at Oregon State University. Thanks for being here, David.
Thank you so much, and congratulations to all my fellow finalists. This is really great books y'all have written, and thank you to you for all of y'all for coming. I'm going to read the opening portion of the book. The book tells the story of the rise and fall of my Jewish upbringing in a very conservative and Orthodox community in Houston, Texas, and about how I got kicked out of that community and then returned to that place where I grew up some nearly 40 years later. And this is how the book opens. I never told anyone this, but for a time, I thought I would be a rabbi when I grew up. Not that I thought about it every day, but especially during my teenage years, by which time it was already too late. Not what you'd think of when you imagine the mystique of a deep down Texas childhood with the cattle and pump jacks and muggy vastness, pine pollen and red dirt, the farm to market road stitching together lonesome towns that get hotter after the sun sets, evangelical radio, Friday night football, Lone Star flags flying over all the gas stations, 80,000 miles of freeways and billboards, boots and belts and 10-gallon hats. But I don't know how else to describe it. Chanting Hebrew prayers inside the magnetism of Texas lore was my open range of obligation, my 254 counties of faith, my book of third and long. Dots and dashes slashing across the Siddur, the Jewish prayer book, were my hominy and grits, my leaves of trees budding in February, my hot bowls of chili, my Davy Crockett at the Alamo. The silky ink of Genesis and Exodus stained the flat drawl in my mouth, more gentility than twang, so that I felt paltry and sensuous. The verses cutting into the violent weather of my imagination with their multitudes, curved tropes skittering across the pages like a two-step, a deliberate memento and admonition of how human beings behave. Since my first religious experiences were passed through blood, nothing went amiss. Even in the 1970s in Houston, we still weren't so distant from the lesson of Auschwitz that no one cared that Jews were being murdered. Nor were we so distant from my grandfather's shtetl childhood in Ukraine before the First World War, with stories of buying a cow and taking it to the shachet, the butcher trained under Jewish law. Everybody kept kosher in Cherna Ostrov. No such thing not keeping kosher. On Fridays, when it was time to bench lich, to bless the lights, there used to be a man who would go out on the streets and holler, "Time to bench lich." Several thousand families gathered in their small homes and lit the Sabbath candles to brighten the way for the Messiah to travel on a glimmering current. With the black prayer book open in my hands, in another era, in another part of the world, when I was a boy in Texas, I too was swept away by a strong current without knowing where it was taking me. Each word quickening like a dancer who refuses to slip away unnoticed, a folk dance performed over and over without rest in the face of all obstacles. None of that required getting used to. I was an heir to it. Hebrew was a home that had been bequeathed. It came as naturally to my body as fingers and toes. It would have been weird not to be Jewish where I lived in Texas, or to hear someone announce he was renouncing Judaism, quitting Judaism with no intention to practice Judaism in the future. Yet with all this, there was something frightening about it, of disaster to come, like a portent of thunderclouds over the lowlands. I suppose when I thought of becoming a rabbi, what I wanted was to give myself a life of enduring myths. And I must have thought to live as a person of faith would purify my principles. I became a writer instead. No great leap. We ask, where are you from? The question is a way of finding out what separates you from me, what distinguishes you before you got wherever you are that isn't where you're from. Who were you before you were this person? What is the landscape and the weather, the outlook and spirit, ambiance or disposition from where you began your journey? What inclinations make up the very source and provenance of you, the raw materials out of which you were made, your imprint, your cause? To search your past is to organize a series of queries about yourself that allow you to discover what actions and events, what behaviors and decisions have led you to ask those very questions. Each question begs another question. Your history gets unraveled, and with it, the histories of the people you shared your past with. Because I grew up in Meyerland, the historic Jewish section of Houston, and because I left at the age of 18 after a public quarrel with one of the city's leading rabbis, the rabbi who'd been my rabbi since I was 4 years old. And because I have had almost no contact for decades with most anyone down there, because I left that community and never returned, never called, not so much as mailed a postcard, I often have a bout of trepidation about going, well, home. Since 1982, I've been back to Meyerland but 2 or 3 times. It's always been in passing and always accompanied by a feeling that carries me right to the edge of dread, fatigue, hostility, and disillusion. Still, I love being an expatriate Texan. Texas holds the landscape, if not the mise en scène, of my true spirit. I miss the bright, massive skies, the swarming parade of clouds chasing the wind for miles and miles. I see nothing wrong with barbecue ribs for breakfast. My go-to cookbook is the Homesick Texan Cookbook, with recipes for pickled okra and chicken fried steak and buttermilk pie. My oldest brother lives in Texas on a ranch. My 90-year-old father lives in Texas. And yet the few times I have passed through Meyerland, that is, I find myself with no effort at all, able to see into my old homeland something like a sequence of moments, the map of a private history from which I quickly, and to my mind, dangerously retrieve my ex-self, with all the old disaffection, fear, knowledge of death, scent of beauty, reflections on difficult thoughts, wonder against righteousness, and curiosity against survival, until finally, at last, I find myself settled into a great sadness. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Our next reader is ready. Hi, Allison. Thanks for being here. Allison Cobb is the author of After We All Died, which was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award in Poetry, Born to, and Greenwood. She works for the Environmental Defense Fund. Hi, Allison.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to Literary Arts. It's such an honor to be here with all of you. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to read from this book, Plastic and Autobiography. And one of the things it does is chart my travels across the country as part of my obsession with this large plastic carpet, which I have beside me. I'll show it to you. It comes from a Honda Odyssey, and it became the Odyssey of the book to try and return this car part to its point of origin at the Honda Odyssey factory in Lincoln, Alabama, which is where all the world's Odysseys are made. Lots of other stuff happens in the book. You will see that I did not succeed in returning the car part to the factory. So if you want to find out what happens, though, you have to read the book. You find out at the end what happens with that. But I'm just going to read from the preface to the book tonight. It starts with an epigraph by Rebecca Solnit. I wanted to trace the lost patterns that came before the world was broken and find the new ones we could make out of the shards. The thing turned up in a corner of the yard just outside the fence. I found it when I went out to take Quincy for a walk. Curved and black, plastic, 4 feet long, a foot at its widest. I thought at first it was a car bumper. I put it in the grass by the porch. The next morning it was still there. I sat next to it in the sun and looked closely. It was not the first piece of plastic junk I had sat staring at. For nearly a year, I'd been picking up all the plastic I found on my daily dog walk. I'd been arranging it into patterns, taking photographs. I'd been storing it all up in plastic garbage bags on the back porch. I didn't know exactly why I was doing this. I wanted to understand something. Plastic on the dog walk, plastic on visits to the beach, plastic studding the ground everywhere I looked. I gathered it all up. I am the no and the yes. A line from the poet Hannah Sobelman's first book. It has lived with me for years, sometimes whispering through my mind in its old remembered rhythm. In the poem, Sobelman follows the line with a qualifying phrase. She narrows it, makes it domestic, but I want the raw declaration hanging there on the turn of itself. I am the no and the yes. For nearly half my life, I have worked for an environmental group. I spend most of my days in front of a computer screen, taking in a deluge of information about planetary trauma and emergency. Most of it floods through me, too vast to grasp. But plastic was a shard that stuck. Plastic I could touch, and it could touch me back. I dragged the car part inside the house. Nearly 10 years later, it sits beside me near my desk. I learned this, that the world is not broken, or that it has always been shards, kaleidoscopically interwoven, not one world, many, threaded through one another, like fungus hyphae through soil. Worlds end. As Catherine Yusoff points out, in a billion Black Anthropocenes or none. Some worlds have ended over and over, lives consumed and discarded by individuals woven into systems that give them life and death power, like settler colonialism, like capitalism. These are systems built by humans, but they exceed individuals. They extend across generations and geographies, planet-scale forces of destruction. Plastic waste stems from this consume and dispose violence. I learned that waste is not an unintended consequence of a miracle new technology. Waste is inherent in plastic production as it accelerated after World War II. In 1945, days before the US military incinerated 2 cities with atomic bombs, a DuPont executive looked forward to the end of the war and the surge of buying that would follow as soldiers returned home and bought houses and cars, washing machines, and refrigerators. The job ahead, he told a group of marketing experts, see to it that Americans are never satisfied. Plastic embodies this infinite desire, conjured out of gas and oil, the seemingly endless reservoirs of dead plants and animals underlying Earth. Plastic transmutes death into eternal life. The word plastic refers not to any specific object, just the quality of a material, that it is capable of taking shape, an endless stream of shapes. Objects formed from plastic ease suffering and save lives. Artificial hearts, IV bags, the tubes snaking out of a respirator. Plastic makes cars safer, airplanes lighter, and delivers drinking water. The single largest use of plastic, though, is for containing other objects. 40% goes into packaging to be used once and then discarded, driving endless demand for more. Companies work to keep these facts hidden. When the evidence becomes too overwhelming, plastic clogging roadsides, oceans, living bodies, companies shift responsibility onto us, individuals, through things like anti-littering campaigns, and ensure that taxpayers and municipalities pay the tab for managing all that waste. The lives harmed at every step, human and non-human, drop out of the equation. The same consume and dispose violence threads through me also. It has benefited me my whole life. I grew up the daughter of a nuclear physicist in Los Alamos, the town that built the atomic bombs, which ended some lives in order to save others perceived to have more value. We are woven into the same net, me and bombs and this car part. For a decade, I followed threads that tie us together through airplanes and sailors, the hydrogen bomb, Pacific Islands, the Nazis, and Heidegger. I followed threads through silence, loss, and grief, through the birth of chemistry and the invention of radar, through patriarchy, empire, and chattel slavery. I followed threads through apologies and their failure, through a pandemic and an uprising, and living lungs struggling to breathe, through old wounds and new ones, hurt, reverberating, aching to be remembered. This object, a book and its journeys, this broken down car part, its life. This is my no. I have wanted this car part and its entanglements, often ugly ones and painful, to leave me. I have wanted not to have to face in my privilege the terms of its existence. I learned this. There is nowhere to go. The same terms that made this piece of plastic made me, my own body, in each of my breaths. This is also, it must be, my yes. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Allison. So good to hear you. Our next reader, hi, Mary.
Hello.
Mary Emerick is the author of 2 previous books, The Geography of Water and Fire in the Heart, a memoir of friendship, loss, and wildfire. She has published several nature-based essays in journals and anthologies. She lives and writes in the Wallowa Mountains of Northeast Oregon.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's really an honor and a privilege, and interesting to hear these other books, and I'm going to go out and buy them. So I'm going to read tonight from The Last Layer of the Ocean, which is about kayaking in Alaska and how I escaped Oregon for a brief time to move to Alaska to find out what I was really made of. The chapter I'm going to read from is called Sweep Stroke. Sweep stroke. It's harder than it looks to turn a boat in a 180. You can sprawl all over the ocean if you want to, but a sweep stroke is the better way. You have to get a little bit uncomfortable to do a sweep stroke. You need to lean on an edge, get enough to help with the turn, but not enough to flip. Look up towards your feet, place your paddle in the water at a spot roughly parallel to them. Swing the paddle decisively in a curve toward the stern. This is a stroke you need to put some muscle behind. The more determined you are, the faster your boat will swing around. When would you need a sweep stroke? Perhaps your kayaking partner is in trouble and you need to go back. Maybe they're trying to point out deer swimming between islands. Or perhaps you have lost your way and you must return to the last place that feels familiar. That's when a sweep stroke comes in handy. I lay sleepless in the tent on the first night of a 5-day kayak wilderness patrol, the rifle beside me. The tide was coming in, creeping with delicate fingers over the cobble beach, sweeping the stranded ocean creatures and the driftwood back out to sea. Rain fell in intermittent bursts on the tarp stretched above the tent. Listening closely, I could hear the heartbeat of the ancient forest, the sweep of dense branches as the trees circled overhead in a dance with the wind, the mouthfuls of rain gulped down to the dark soil below their roots. Helga and I had set up our tents close to a bear trail, not by choice, but by circumstance. The cliffs a dizzying plunge into ocean, hardly anything flat for miles. We found this small stretch of beach, curving up into a spruce forest, and pulled our kayaks far from the tide line, securing them with rope to keep 2 logs buried in sand. We had forced our tents into the space between beach fringe and water, the bear tracks close enough to nearly reach out and touch. I curled around cold steel like a lover, my talisman for a safe night. The rifle, a .375 H&H, was tough to carry in the field. The sling slipped off my shoulder and it was hard to manhandle through bushy cedar thickets and while balancing on slick rocks in the intertidal zone. It had to be babied, massaged with oil, cotton patches pushed through the guts after I fired it, no matter how long the day had been. I did not have the patience for it. There was nowhere good to carry it in the kayak. It was too long for the hatches. Keeping it fastened to the deck made the boat unstable. I ended up shoving it down the cockpit with the bags of trash where it got in the way and lay in a puddle of salt water. Mo, who did the end of season maintenance, frowned when I showed up. "Why is this rifle so rusty?" he wanted to know. He sent me off with oil and a bunch of rags. "You have to treat that rifle right. It might save your life," he lectured. I didn't like shooting it at the range either. There was not enough meat in the place below my shoulder where the rifle needed to go, and I could end up with bruises from the recoil. It was loud too, and I flinched in anticipation, my shots ending up low and to the right. Because the Forest Service required me to carry it, I complied, although I was not sure I'd be able to shoot a bear if things went wrong. Guns were so casual in town. A second thought, people carried them the way women carried purses in other towns. A newcomer to guns, before each practice shot, I hesitated. The spiral of the shell out of the barrel seemed so final, something I couldn't take back. A few years before, one of the timber cruisers had shot a bear that had circled him in the woods before charging. The bear fell 7 feet from his boots. Then there were the stories people passed around at night. The hunter attacked near the waterline in Port Alexander, his screams heard by his companions, who promptly ran to the village to drink themselves into a stupor before attempting rescue. Another man found mauled, alone in a remote bay, signs of a struggle. A man knocked off his bicycle. I remembered them all in my tent. "Hang in there, Gertrude," I said aloud. Gertrude was my alter ego, a burly sidekick I had recently invented to somehow embody the guts and stamina a visitor should possess in this wild place. Gertrude had no soft underbelly. She had no inner critic. She carried a rifle easily and did not lie awake wondering what was making the noise outside the tent. She dove into life head first. Sometimes I was her. Other times I wanted to give in, collapse in a heap, escape the endless rain, the shivering and damp layers of clothes, the clammy darkness, and the constant vigilance I needed to maintain out here. A shuffle in the woods brought me half upright, switching on my headlamp. "What's that?" I called out. "Just me, getting up to pee," Helga said. Helga was a tiny spitfire, topped with a spray of golden hair. I had gotten lucky when I found her as my usual kayaking partner. Athletic and direct, she was able to tie bowlines, carry a loaded boat across an estuary, and say what she meant all at the same time. Helga was as unspooled as I was wound up tight. While I worried over the consequences of a steep southern swell that tossed our boats around Lake Driftwood, when I fretted about the humpback whales that could easily knock us into an unforgiving sea, she remained as unruffled as the water in a protected bay. If a bear came in the night, she reasoned, that meant our time was up. She didn't lie awake the way I did. She had seen her share of heartbreak, but she shrugged it off better than I could. Things happened. Uncharted rocks scraped the bottom of your boat. Bears chose the same paths you did. Your heart broke sometimes. It just went on. I knew there were things in the night that a tent couldn't keep out. If Helga knew that too, she did not say so. On the outer edge of our bay, the part that faced the sea, waves worried the rocky beach. Beyond us, back in the woods, I sensed that bears moved like the ghosts of the people we had been before we had come to Alaska to shed our skins. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Our next reader is Erin. Hi, Erin.
Hey, Jessica.
Erin's Gilbreath's essays have appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Dublin Review, been nominated for a James Beard Award and named notable in Best American Essays, Best American Travel Writing, and Best American Sports Writing. His latest book is about the cult classic 1994 album, Deconstruction. Thanks for being here, Erin.
Thanks for having us. Every time I think about literary arts, I just feel grateful that we live in a state like this where we have so many incredible writers and so many readers in a place that can connect us all like this every year. I'm going to read the introduction to just a part of it. What's interesting is that the first time I went through the valley that this book is about was on a road trip with my best friend in 1995, and I'd never heard of the place, and it just was flat and farmy and funky smelling, and I loved it. And I couldn't stop thinking about it when I got back home to Arizona. And for the second half of the 90s, I just kept going back and exploring, and it just got its claws in me. And I took about 20 years to figure out how to write about it. But I was digging through my basement recently, and I found this, what I thought was a sketchbook, and it turned out to be my first attempt to write this book, and I'd totally forgotten about it. So I pasted in some pictures of the natural world and other drawings, and even hashed out a table of contents. So it really did get its claws in me. So it's exciting to be here, having started this as a college journal and now have a legit book. So this is the story of a historic boat trip that a Central California historian took in 1938 from Bakersfield to San Francisco when there was enough water to connect those places. And I retraced his route by car during the 2014 drought. On June 18th, 1938, the Bakersfield, California told the story of local resident Frank Lauda's boat launch in an article entitled "Kern Boatman on Way to SF via Water." Before a large crowd assembled early this morning on the north bank of Kern River at the Chester Bridge, the article said, the little party embarked in the Alta, a 15-foot skiff equipped with an outboard motor and homemade paddles for the young crew. The Alta was floating from Bakersfield to San Francisco through what's become one of the most productive agricultural regions in human history. It was an impossible sounding trip. No one on record had completed it before, and no one has done it since. A crowd gathered on this warm Saturday as Lauda's small 4-person crew launched their skiff into the Kern River. Quote, motion picture cameras purred and still cameras clicked, making a record of the start of the voyage, the paper reported. The boat's white side sported the words Kern County Special, Bakersfield to Treasure Island, painted in a steady, precise hand. The crew packed navigational charts, food, blankets, gasoline, and a second backup motor. Although Lauda's trip wasn't what cowboys would call his first rodeo, it was too arduous for him to complete alone. He needed help protecting supplies from water damage, hauling the boat across dry spots, and navigating while he took notes. 3 kids accompanied him on the whole trip. His 12-year-old son, Don, and 2 local boys, 16-year-old Ernest Engels and 17-year-old Richard Harris. Lauda taught Engels and Harris at the local high school. A 4th team named Ted Collins joined them on the 4th day of the trip, but Collins' name simply stops appearing in newspaper articles by his 5th day. The papers never say what happened. As the boat swung out from the shore, the paper said, Don Lauda, a youngster, called out to his mother on the bank, "This is one time, Mother, you can't spank me for getting wet." And he made a paddling motion. The crowd on the levee bank laughed at his sally. In the good ship Alta were rubber inner tubes sealed ingeniously on each end to contain cameras and other articles to prevent their injury should they become wet. Some of the river waterways, large and powerful with flood currents, will make phases of the trip dangerous unless precautions such as this are taken, the paper said. Lauda, his teenage crew, and their skiff were at the edge of a landscape that was known, but at the same time, still wild. According to the Federal Census Bureau, the American frontier officially ended in 1890, meaning there was no land left to meaningfully explore or settle. However, pockets of rugged, wilder lands remained in the American West in the early 20th century, places where adventure seekers could still experience a more primeval America of unlogged forests and undammed rivers. And as widely settled as California was by 1938, the San Joaquin Valley in the state's flat center still offered opportunities for wild experiences. Cougars prowled its oak woods. Oops, I lost my place, sorry. Deer nibbled native grasses, and dense cottonwood forests still lined its many rivers, even as cattle roamed the lowlands that once belonged to elk and scrub brush. Lauda's boat trip was probably the last of those adventures in this semi-wild place, and it marked the beginning of a time when people, not nature, determined the fate of California's water. Sandwiched between the mountain ranges of the Sierra Nevada and the Coast Range, California's Great Central Valley runs 430 miles through the middle of the state. It consists of 2 long rivers named for their primary rivers, the Sacramento Valley in the north and the San Joaquin Valley in the south. The Sacramento Valley stretches approximately 165 miles from the town of Redding south to the city of Sacramento. And the San Joaquin Valley stretches 265 miles north and south and averages 47 miles across, 75 at its widest, wide enough that you can't see its edges on hazy days. The drive through the San Joaquin Valley you drive through the valley between LA and San Francisco, and you cross it to reach Tahoe and Yosemite. It covers 8 million acres, houses 4 million people, has some of California's fastest growing cities, 4 of America's 5 highest grossing agricultural counties, and some of the nation's worst air pollution. It's serviced by 2 large north-south freeways. And yet many people have lived their whole lives in Berkeley and Santa Cruz have never heard this part of their state referred to as the San Joaquin Valley. Some who are aware of it mistakenly call it the Central Valley. Others think of it in terms of vague subregions. There's the wine country foothills, the gold country, the hot, flat Fresno Bakerfield section at the bottom. Most think of the valley as one long roadside bathroom break, as California's flyover country, the West's Midwest, and they try to get through it as quickly as possible. But most things here are gears in the machine that runs one of the most productive agricultural regions in human history. And the San Joaquin isn't wine country. It isn't gold country. It's its own country, with its own fascinating natural history and settlement history, and its own unique climate, produce, and problems. In November 2014, during the most severe drought in California's 500 years of recorded history, I retraced Lotta's trip through the San Joaquin Valley. Reading about Lotta's boat trip in the Bakersfield, Californian, I decided to follow his route, this time by car, and try to recreate the story. I'd driven through the valley many times during the previous 2 decades. I'd read scores of books about it and spent lots of time exploring its tiny nature preserves, back roads, and overlooked cities, but I still couldn't make sense of the place. The valley mystified me. Scorching in summer, foggy in winter, and devoid of significant topography, this flat fucking landscape wasn't beautiful in the obvious sense, and yet it was beautiful. Its history and ecology were more fascinating than it let on. Something about its shapes, colors, and fragrances demanded my attention, just as its underdog status made me want to know it even more. Frank Forrest Lotta was the San Joaquin's most important early historian. Born in 1892, where the Oristimba Creek flows into the San Joaquin Valley near the barely there settlement of Newman, Lotta became enthralled by history as a kid. Interstate 5 now runs by the creek's mouth, but the creek used to cross the Camino Viejo, a road that the Spanish built in the 1700s to connect the bay with Los Angeles. In 1906, Lotta's old grammar school teacher, Edith V. Hollingsworth, suggested that the 14-year-old Frank interview the people who'd settled their Western Merced County School District for a history project. History soon became his life's central focus. By 1938, the year of the boat launch, he was 46 years old and an experienced outdoorsman. Standing 6 feet tall with a face that was photographed as quietly contemplative or youthfully happy. He wore a short mustache and kept his dark hair tight on the sides in a military-type crew cut, standing high on his head. Sometimes he carried a broad-brimmed hat in the field. Sometimes he wore a sport coat and tie. And despite the summer heat, he stood in the boat on this day with his long-sleeve collared shirt tucked into his clean high-waisted trousers and his prescription glasses in his front pocket. He was used to heat. His high school project led to a lifetime of work interviewing early Valley residents. He reached those first interviewees on horseback, including James Hitchcock, who came to California on the first wagons to cross the Sierra Nevada when the state was still part of Mexico, before the doomed Donner Party. 10 years later, Lotta reached his next subjects in his beat-up, roofless Model T with half a windshield. In 1916, for 2 days in August, he drove down the valley's swampy center toward Bakersfield, talking with old-timers about whom to interview and camping outdoors by himself. He bounced down rough roads described in the local paper as mostly gravel, some oiled. One was made from a, quote, 16-foot concrete pavement with broken edges and cracks every 20 feet. Even though the roads were primitive and the sound of freight trains kept them up all night. Lotta described his first journey into Tulare County as the most interesting one he ever made, and he took countless journeys during his long life. That's the kind of thing I wanted to taste when I followed him. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. So good to hear you. All right, and last but not least is Tina Ontiveros. Tina grew up below the poverty line and went to community college. As a writer and a teacher, her work explores class, shame, and social constructs that marginalize the poor. A former bookseller, Tina is a faithful advocate for indie bookstores. She teaches writing and literature at Columbia Gorge Community College. Thanks for being here, Tina.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm so glad I got to go last. It's such a gift to listen to everybody. And just hearing each of you makes me feel like, I don't know, like I must have done something right to be in such good company. So I think I will not, I thought about reading from the beginning, but I think instead I won't. I think I'll read, so Rough House is a book about growing up below the poverty line, being raised by beautiful, flawed people. It's about the people who made me, who were addicts, but also good parents. Those two things don't necessarily exclude one another. So I thought what I would do is most of the stories in the book revolve around my dad, Lloyd, and my stepmother, Linda. So I'm going to read you just a short anecdote about Lloyd, and then I'll read you a short anecdote about Linda. Just give them each a minute here to shine. So this is a tall tale my dad, Lloyd, used to tell about a day that he was out logging in the woods. He was a logger. So, and I warn you, he loved bad jokes. And if I was going to let Lloyd talk, I was going to let Lloyd talk. So my favorite was the story about the day Lloyd popped his eye out in the woods. He was packing out his saw at the end of the day when it happened. He was last man out, thinking about catching up to his buddies to grab a beer before heading home, as he picked his path through the thick litter of forest floor. I can see this scene. That was the trick of Lloyd's stories. He always set them up with a simple hook, something true and clear I automatically trusted. He knew his audience. We were timber children, so this story had a beginning so familiar we could picture it right off. We knew Lloyd packed his saw out on his left shoulder always. We knew the blade would lay flat and steady over the space between his neck and his shoulder and run out in front of him as if leading the way. The motor just behind him, cased in hard orange plastic, his left hand flung up over the blade, the crook of his elbow against the chain, keeping the saw steady for his hike out. I knew the way my dad packed his saw out of the woods, like I knew the sound of my own breath from inside my head. I could even smell Lloyd, sweat, sawdust, gasoline, and hear the snapping of his feet breaking 1,000 unknown things with each step. This image was truth. Lloyd said he was packing out his saw when he put his black steel-toed boot down and it sank into forest flotsam and landed with full weight of man and saw on a branch fallen from above. It was a big one, kids. If I'd been standing there when it fell, I could have been a widowmaker. The branch was too strong to snap, so when Lloyd stepped on it, he created a fulcrum and seesawed it up into his own face like a bad cartoon. That branch couldn't have been a better length to do him damage. He said it came right up and gouged his eye clean out. I shit you not. That sucker just poked right in there at the corner of my eye and popped. Before I knew it, my goddamn eye was hanging out in front of my face and I was in a world of hurt. I had so many questions here. Questions I never asked, because from earliest days, I understood my role in maintaining Lloyd's fictions. Daddy misses you. Daddy's sorry. Daddy wishes your mama would let him see you. Daddy's gonna come get you just as soon as he gets a car, a paycheck, a break from work. Still, I wanted to know so many things. I wondered if his eye could see anything as it lay there suspended by tendrils never meant to know open air. I wondered if that eye sent images to his brain of the leafy bracken below, or maybe his own cheek, lips, chin. I always at least half believed Lloyd, and if there was any chance this story was true, I wanted to know what the eye saw from its foreign angle. But I never asked. Too many details might expose the story as fiction, and I didn't want to let go of the possibility of truth. Lloyd stood there gauging his options. He was alone in the forest, chainsaw on his left shoulder, metal lunch pail in his right hand, thermos tucked into his right armpit, right eye dangling on top of his cheekbone, and a couple of miles to go before he was literally out of the woods. Kids, a man's got to do what a man's got to do. He squatted down, dropped his lunch pail and thermos, set his still on the ground, and went about the awkward business of handling his loose eye with dirty, calloused hands. My dad had hands with their own incredible landscapes. There were soft sandy beaches and dry scorched deserts on those hands. There were cracks so deep that black grease had seeped in to create permanent lines, marking out the boundaries between all the territories of his hands. And here he was, about to cup his exposed eyeball in a greasy, sweaty palm, about to use his rough fingers coated in sawdust, painted on with oil, gasoline, premix, to gingerly touch his vulnerable, precious eyeball. Well, kids, right then I figured, ah, hell, can a man fall trees with only one eye? I wasn't sure. I just knew I couldn't fall trees if I died before getting out of them woods. So I had to do something, and I'll be damned if I'm going to leave my saw behind. So I put this part of my palm up under my eye and just shoved it back in. It hurt like a son of a bitch, but what else could I do? Lloyd didn't even try to open the eye. He didn't want to think about what that might feel like, and he'd had enough trauma in the woods for one day. He hefted his saw back up on his shoulder, tucked his thermos back into his armpit, grabbed his lunch pail, and finished packing himself out with that eye shut the whole time. Man alive, my pickup sure was a sight for sore eye. He threw his saw on the bed, set everything else on the bench seat, jumped in, and headed straight for the hospital. It was the only time in his life he took himself to a doctor without some woman hollering at him to do so. According to Lloyd, the doctor could see no course of action but to pop the eye back out. They needed to clean out the sawdust and whatnot Lloyd had gotten up in there. He had to hang his head over a stainless steel basin so his eye could float in some saline mixture until the doctor was satisfied it was clean. Then that doctor popped Lloyd's eye back into the socket, good as new. Lloyd's eyes were beautiful, and I always loved looking in my daddy's hazel green eyes. Good or bad, his eyes told you exactly what he was thinking and where he was headed. I knew by looking at his eyes if I should run toward him or run away. Lloyd's eyes are my eyes, though I always thought they were more magic on his face than mine. After he told that story, I was always lingering on the right eye, trying to find evidence to back his story, but it looked the same as it ever had. And now I'm going to read a short piece about my stepmother, Linda. And let's see, this is when my dad was a bit of a vagabond, never lived in the same place for very long, and this is a summer that they were living in a rented house in Yakima. Sometimes I imagine Linda standing at the kitchen sink in Yakima, looking out at us pulling weeds in the garden. She would banish my brother and I outside all day, so we weren't in her hair. What did she feel? What thoughts went through her head as she watched us perpetually dirty and wearing t-shirts too tight, pants too short? Proud to collect scars, always in need of haircuts, independent in ways that testified to the lack of adult supervision in our daily lives. I bet she stood there thinking of her own two daughters, their wheat blonde hair so light and fine their eyebrows disappeared in summer, and their blue eyes. They were the cleanest kids I'd ever met. Pristine and polite, their clothing coordinated, and they never had holes in their socks. Even their pajamas were matching sets. I only met them once or twice, and I couldn't tell if Linda saw them sometimes without us or if she just didn't see them. Mom sent Lloyd school pictures every year. The pictures Linda had of her girls hardly ever changed, so I took that to mean their dad didn't bother much to keep in touch. Those girls are what Linda lost. I never learned the details of how or why. Linda was a different sort of addict than Lloyd. She was the tortoise to his hare. He was binge, explode, purge, all speed and wiry energy. Linda was slow and steady wins the race. She walked through space like the air around her was thick, her movements slow and careful. Linda had been raised in a nice home by parents who seemed fancy to me. I'd only met them briefly, but I imagined her dad read books and her mom used words like poise. Linda had been on trips that required airplanes. She'd married a man with a steady job and owned a home. Her kids had college savings and excused themselves to go to the bathroom if they needed to pass gas. Lloyd had never fallen from grace because he'd never known it. He came from backwoods trash and was happy that way. He'd ask anyone, anywhere to pull his finger. But Linda seemed different. I remember visiting her parents in Ellensburg. Their house reminded me of a commercial for Glade air freshener, with white curtains and a wide porch. I thought she must really love Lloyd to leave that sort of life behind. Looking back, I think clean living made Linda feel ugly. I think she was afraid everything she touched was made dirty by her hands. She was constantly washing her hands. That's why Linda, of all the players in Lloyd's traveling shit show, scares me the most. Linda's life with Lloyd was not a natural extension of what she'd always known. Her life was loss, constant penance for her addictions. She'd slept in clean beds under duvets that smelled like fabric softener, Now she slept under a rough green army surplus blanket and moved from rental to trailer to shack, from one small mill town to another. Now she rarely saw her daughters, and when she did, she felt undeserving. Now her teeth were rotting out. Now she worked at a dive cafe, adding water, then more mix, then more water, carefully trying to balance out the pancake batter every morning. And now I imagine she stands at that kitchen window in Yakima and looks out at Jesse and me crouching in the garden, our bare knees sunk directly into soft dirt. We were the kind of children she wasn't afraid to touch. I would reach both palms down and thrust them forward in the soil, letting it flow through my fingers, over my hands, all the way up to my elbows, and my little body would sing with the earthly pleasure of it. How could she resist comparing me to her own lovely daughters, angelic in their inaccessibility? In my strange fantasy, she thinks of them practicing piano or flute in the light-filled house she left behind, being dropped off by their father at ballet class or softball practice, and I imagine she felt sure of her choice. Keeping her distance preserved them. Thank you.